The winter of 1939 arrives in Finland with temperatures plunging to 40 degrees below zero. Soviet forces have crossed the border in overwhelming numbers, 500,000 men, supported by thousands of tanks advancing into Finnish territory. The Red Army expects this to be a brief campaign, a matter of weeks before the small Nordic nation capitulates. They are catastrophically wrong. The Finns are about to demonstrate that determination, ingenuity, and the right weapons can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Finland in 1939 possesses a population of less than 4 million people, facing a Soviet Union with a population exceeding 170 million. The disparity in military resources is even more staggering. The Red Army fields thousands of tanks. The Finnish Army has perhaps 24 armored vehicles, most of them obsolete. Soviet artillery outnumbers Finnish guns by ratios of 30-1 in some sectors. Soviet aircraft darken the skies, while the Finnish Air Force operates fewer than 100 fighters and bombers combined. By every conventional measure, Finland should be crushed within days. But Finland has advantages the Soviets do not anticipate. The terrain is a maze of forests, lakes, and marshlands that channelize advancing armor onto predictable routes. The Finnish soldiers know this landscape intimately, having trained in these conditions their entire lives. The winter favors defenders who understand how to operate in extreme cold. And critically, Finland has weapons specifically designed to kill Soviet tanks. One of these weapons was the Lahti L-39 anti-tank rifle. Aimo Lahti designed this weapon in the mid-1930s when the threat of Soviet invasion was already becoming apparent. Finland needed a portable anti-tank weapon that individual soldiers could carry and deploy without vehicle support. Tank armor in the 1930s was relatively thin. Most Soviet tanks of the period had armor ranging from 6 to 15 millimeters in thickness. A powerful enough rifle firing a large enough projectile could penetrate that armor and disable the vehicle. Lahti set out to create exactly that weapon. The L-39 fired a massive 20 by 138 millimeter B cartridge, a round originally developed for anti-aircraft autocannons. This was not a rifle cartridge in any conventional sense. It was an artillery shell, scaled down to be fired from a weapon that could theoretically be carried by one man, though in practice it required a crew of 2 or 3 to operate effectively. The projectile weighed approximately 150 grams, more than 5 ounces of hardened steel and explosive, traveling at more than 2,500 feet per second. The kinetic energy was devastating. Against the light armor of early Soviet tanks, the L-39 was lethally effective. But physics is unforgiving. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. When the L-39 fired that massive projectile downrange with enough energy to punch through tank armor, the rifle generated recoil that was almost uncontrollable. The weapon weighed over 100 pounds fully loaded with its magazine and bipod, yet the recoil was violent enough to injure the shooter if proper precautions were not taken. The stock design included a massive buffer system spring, but even with this mitigation, firing the L-39 was an experience that left soldiers bruised and battered. Aimo Lahti understood the recoil problem from the beginning. The initial design incorporated several features to manage it: a long recoil operation where the barrel and bolt recoiled together for several inches before unlocking, a substantial buffer system, and a stock design that distributed forces as evenly as possible across the shooter's shoulder. But these measures were not enough. Combat reports from the earliest engagements of the Winter War confirmed what testing had suggested. The L-39 was effective against Soviet armor, but the recoil was punishing enough to reduce the rate of fire and exhaust crews after relatively few shots. They would position themselves to minimize the exposure of other friendly forces to the lateral blast. The weapon remained effective, but it required more careful employment than the standard version. The Winter War lasted 105 days, from November 1939 through March 1940. During this period, Finnish forces destroyed or disabled approximately 2,000 Soviet tanks. The L-39 anti-tank rifle accounted for hundreds of these kills. Finnish soldiers employed the weapon with devastating effectiveness, targeting the thin side and rear armor of Soviet tanks, aiming for vision ports and weak points in the hull, firing into engine compartments to set vehicles ablaze. The massive 20mm projectile would penetrate the armor, fragment inside the crew compartment, and kill or wound the tank crew. Tanks disabled by L-39 fire would block narrow forest roads, creating obstacles that channelized follow-on Soviet armor into kill zones, where Finnish forces waited with more anti-tank weapons. The muzzle brake proved its worth during these engagements. Crews operating muzzle brake-equipped weapons could maintain higher rates of fire for longer periods. The reduced recoil allowed for more accurate follow-up shots, critical when engaging moving targets or attempting to hit specific weak points on armored vehicles. The physical toll on crew members was noticeably less, allowing them to remain effective throughout extended engagements. Finnish after-action reports documented that crews preferred the muzzle brake-equipped weapons despite the increased blast and noise, considering the recoil reduction worth the trade-offs. Soviet tank crews learned to fear the distinctive report of the L-39. The sound of a 20mm anti-tank rifle firing was unmistakable and terrifying. It meant that somewhere within a few hundred meters, a Finnish crew had line of sight to their vehicle and was firing projectiles capable of punching through armor and killing everyone inside. Soviet tactical doctrine began to emphasize avoiding forested areas where L-39 crews might be concealed, calling for artillery preparation before advancing through suspected Finnish positions and moving tanks at maximum speed through danger areas to minimize exposure. The Finnish soldiers who operated the L-39 developed deep respect for the weapon. It was brutally heavy to carry, weighing over 100 pounds with ammunition and accessories. Moving it through deep snow while wearing skis was exhausting work. The 10-round box magazine weighed several pounds when loaded. Each 20mm cartridge weighed approximately half a pound, meaning a basic combat load of 50 rounds added 25 pounds to the crew's burden. Operating the weapon in temperatures 40 degrees below zero presented constant challenges. Metal parts became brittle, lubricants thickened, and exposed skin would freeze to metal surfaces instantly if proper precautions were not observed. But the weapon worked. It killed Soviet tanks with reliability that few other Finnish weapons could match. A well-placed shot from an L-39 could disable a tank worth hundreds of thousands of rubles and eliminate a crew of 3 to 5 trained soldiers. The tactical value was enormous. Finnish defensive positions built around L-39 crews could hold off Soviet armor advances that otherwise would have been unstoppable. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was significant. Knowing that Finnish infantry possessed weapons capable of destroying tanks from concealed positions made every advance through forested terrain a nerve-wracking experience. The massive muzzle brake became a recognizable feature of the weapon. Photographs from the Winter War show Finnish soldiers with their L-39 rifles, the distinctive multi-port muzzle brake clearly visible extending from the barrel. The brake was not installed on every L-39. Some weapons retained the standard configuration, and crews could choose which version to employ based on tactical requirements. Situations requiring maximum concealment might favor the standard configuration. Situations requiring sustained fire against multiple targets might favor the muzzle brake version. The Finnish Army maintained both configurations and allowed experienced crews to make their own choices. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, Finland had survived, but at tremendous cost. The peace treaty ceded approximately 10% of Finnish territory to the Soviet Union, including Finland's second-largest city and significant industrial areas. But Finland remained independent, a feat that had seemed impossible when Soviet forces first crossed the border. The L-39 anti-tank rifle had played a measurable role in that survival, destroying enough Soviet armor to slow advances, disrupt timetables, and inflict casualties that exceeded Soviet expectations. The respite lasted 15 months. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Finland entered what Finns call the Continuation War, fighting alongside German forces to reclaim territory lost in 1940. The L-39 returned to service, once again employed against Soviet armor. But the nature of tank warfare had evolved significantly between 1940 and 1941. Soviet tank designs had improved. Armor thickness had increased from 10 to 15 millimeters to 30 to 40 millimeters on newer models like the T-34. The L-39, which had been lethally effective against light tanks of the 1930s, was increasingly inadequate against the heavier armor of 1940s designs. Finnish crews adapted. They could no longer expect to penetrate frontal armor on newer Soviet tanks, so they targeted side and rear plates where armor was thinner. They aimed for tracks and running gear, attempting to immobilize vehicles even if they could not penetrate the hull. They fired at vision ports and commanders' cupolas, hoping to blind the tank or kill crew members through openings in the armor. The tactics evolved to match the changing technology, but the fundamental limitation remained. The L-39 was designed to fight tanks of the 1930s, and it was increasingly outmatched by tanks of the 1940s. Finnish crews began supplementing the L-39 with more powerful anti-tank weapons. Captured Soviet anti-tank guns provided increased penetration capability. German-supplied anti-tank weapons offered modern performance. But the L-39 remained in service throughout the Continuation War, valued for its mobility and the fact that Finnish soldiers knew how to employ it effectively. Weapons that troops understand and trust retain value even when newer equipment becomes available. The muzzle brake continued to prove its worth throughout this period. As engagements became more intense and the need for rapid follow-up shots increased, the recoil reduction provided by the muzzle brake became more valuable. Crews operating in defensive positions where concealment was less critical preferred the muzzle brake version for its improved controllability. The weapon remained brutally loud and produced massive lateral blast, but these characteristics were accepted as necessary trade-offs for the improved performance. The Continuation War ended in September 1944 with another armistice between Finland and the Soviet Union. Finland survived again, remaining independent, but forced to accept significant territorial losses and reparations. The L-39 anti-tank rifle had served throughout both conflicts, from the Winter War through the Continuation War, accumulating a combat record that few other anti-tank rifles could match. Finnish soldiers had employed the weapon in conditions ranging from 40 degrees below zero to summer heat, in forests and across frozen lakes, against every type of Soviet armor, from obsolete tankettes to modern medium tanks. After the war, the L-39 remained in Finnish military service for several more decades. The weapon was recategorized from anti-tank rifle to anti-materiel rifle as tank armor continued to thicken beyond what a 20mm projectile could penetrate. Instead of targeting tanks, the L-39 found new roles engaging bunkers, destroying equipment, and providing long-range precision fire against point targets. The massive 20mm projectile that had once been sized to penetrate tank armor was equally effective at destroying radar installations, disabling vehicles, and engaging targets at ranges beyond what conventional rifles could reach. The muzzle brake remained a feature on many Finnish L-39 rifles through this entire service life. The design proved durable and effective, requiring minimal maintenance and continuing to function in the harsh Finnish climate. Soldiers who had fired the weapon without the muzzle brake and then with it uniformly reported that the brake transformed the L-39 from barely controllable to manageable. The recoil was still substantial. This was still a weapon firing a 20mm cartridge, but it was reduced from punishing to acceptable. The L-39 was finally retired from Finnish military service in the 1990s, more than 50 years after its introduction. Few weapons remain in service for half a century, especially weapons designed for a specific tactical role that had largely ceased to exist decades earlier. The L-39's longevity testified to the soundness of Lahti's original design and the effectiveness of the modifications, including the muzzle brake, that kept the weapon relevant through changing tactical requirements. Today, examples of the L-39 exist in military museums and private collections around the world. The distinctive muzzle brake makes the Finnish variant immediately recognizable. Collectors and historians who have had the opportunity to fire preserved examples universally comment on the recoil characteristics. Even with the muzzle brake installed, the L-39 generates recoil that modern shooters accustomed to conventional rifles find shocking. The weapon is described as punishing, brutal, and exhausting to fire. And yet, it was this weapon that Finnish soldiers carried through frozen forests in 1939, deployed against Soviet tanks, and fired repeatedly in combat conditions that most modern soldiers cannot imagine. The story of the L-39 muzzle brake is not simply a story of technical modification. It is a story about problem-solving under extreme pressure. Finnish forces in 1939 faced an existential threat. They possessed limited resources and needed every weapon to perform at maximum effectiveness. The L-39 was effective against Soviet armor, but the recoil limited its utility. The muzzle brake solved that problem, transforming the weapon into something Finnish soldiers could employ more effectively in combat. The trade-offs were significant. Increased noise, lateral blast, reduced concealment, but the benefits outweighed the costs. The muzzle brake represented a practical solution to a real-world problem, engineered and implemented during wartime when theoretical perfection was less important than immediate effectiveness. Lahti and the Finnish engineers who developed the brake did not have the luxury of extended development timelines or unlimited resources. They had a weapon that worked but could work better, and they had soldiers who needed that improved performance immediately. The muzzle brake was designed, tested, and fielded within months, a remarkably rapid development cycle driven by combat necessity. The lateral blast problem was never fully solved. It was simply accepted as a characteristic of the weapon. Finnish tactical doctrine evolved to accommodate it. Crews learned to position themselves appropriately. Infantry learned to stay clear of the weapon when it fired. The solution was not to eliminate the problem, but to work around it, to develop procedures and tactics that mitigated the negative effects while preserving the positive benefits. This pragmatic approach characterized much of Finnish weapons development and tactical innovation during the Winter War. The L-39, with its massive muzzle brake, became an iconic image of Finnish resistance during the Winter War. Photographs showing Finnish soldiers with the weapon appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world, visual evidence that the small Nordic nation was fighting back against Soviet aggression with whatever tools they could deploy. The weapon looked formidable in photographs, massive, industrial, purpose-built for destruction. The muzzle brake added to this impression, suggesting a weapon so powerful it required substantial engineering just to control its recoil. Modern firearms enthusiasts and historians continue to study the L-39 and its muzzle brake design. The weapon represents a specific moment in firearms development, the transition from rifles being purely anti-personnel weapons to rifles being capable of engaging armored vehicles. The L-39 existed in the narrow window when tank armor was thin enough for a rifle-caliber weapon to penetrate, but thick enough to require a purpose-built design firing specialized ammunition. As tank armor continued to thicken through the 1940s and beyond, this entire category of weapons became obsolete, replaced by recoilless rifles, anti-tank missiles, and other systems capable of penetrating heavier armor. But during its moment of relevance, the L-39 was formidable, and the muzzle brake that Lahti designed to tame its recoil was a critical component of that effectiveness. Finnish soldiers who carried the weapon through the Winter War and Continuation War knew that every shot fired required absorbing tremendous recoil even with the brake installed. They knew that firing the weapon would announce their position to every enemy soldier within hundreds of meters. They knew that the lateral blast would kick up snow and debris and potentially expose their location. And they chose to carry and employ the weapon anyway, because when a Soviet tank appeared through the trees, the L-39 could kill it. The massive muzzle brake was not elegant, it was not subtle, it was not designed to minimize signature or maximize concealment. It was designed to solve one specific problem, reduce recoil enough to allow sustained, accurate fire, and it accomplished that goal effectively. The trade-offs were accepted because the alternative was a weapon that was effective in theory but punishing to employ in practice. The muzzle brake transformed the L-39 from a weapon that could be fired into a weapon that could be fought with, and that distinction mattered enormously to the soldiers whose lives depended on it. Lahti's career as a weapons designer spanned several decades and produced multiple successful designs, but the L-39 remains his most famous creation. The weapon bore his name throughout its service life. Soldiers referred to it as the Lahti rather than using its official designation. The muzzle brake, though a relatively simple addition to the basic design, represented the kind of practical problem-solving that characterized Lahti's approach to weapons engineering. Identify the problem, design a solution, test it, refine it, and field it. No unnecessary complexity, no theoretical perfection, just effective tools for soldiers who needed them. The L-39 muzzle brake survives today as an example of wartime engineering pragmatism. It was not the most sophisticated solution to the recoil problem. Modern muzzle brake designs are far more efficient and produce fewer negative side effects. But it was designed with the materials, manufacturing capabilities, and time constraints available in Finland during the Winter War. It worked with the tolerances that Finnish industry could produce. It could be manufactured in facilities that were simultaneously producing hundreds of other critical military items. It could be installed in the field by an armorer with basic tools. It was, in every sense, an appropriate technology for its time and place. Collectors who own L-39 rifles today recognize the muzzle brake as one of the weapon's distinctive features. The brake adds significantly to the rifle's collector value, particularly when it can be documented as an original Finnish military installation rather than a post-war addition. Museums displaying the L-39 invariably point out the muzzle brake when describing the weapon to visitors, explaining its purpose and the trade-offs it represented. The brake has become inseparable from the weapon's identity, as recognizable as the magazine well or the massive stock assembly. The engineering principles behind the L-39 muzzle brake remain relevant today. Modern large-caliber anti-material rifles invariably incorporate muzzle brakes or suppressors to manage recoil. The specific design has evolved. Modern computational fluid dynamics allows for optimization that was impossible in the 1930s, but the fundamental concept remains identical: redirect propellant gases to counteract recoil forces. The L-39 muzzle brake represented an early successful implementation of this principle, proof that the concept worked even with the limited engineering tools available 80 years ago. Finnish soldiers who survived the Winter War and Continuation War carried memories of the L-39 for the rest of their lives. Veterans interviewed decades later could still describe in detail the process of loading the magazine, chambering the first round, settling into position behind the weapon, acquiring a target through the sights, and pressing the trigger. They remembered the concussive blast, the lateral jets of flame from the muzzle brake ports, the solid punch of recoil, even with the brake installed, and the satisfaction of watching a 20mm projectile strike a Soviet tank and penetrate the armor. These memories remained vivid 60 and 70 years later, testament to the impression the weapon made on those who employed it in combat. The L-39, with its massive muzzle brake, represents a specific answer to a specific problem at a specific moment in military history. Finland needed portable anti-tank weapons. Lahti designed one. The recoil was excessive. Lahti designed a muzzle brake to mitigate it. The brake worked, but introduced new challenges. Finnish soldiers adapted their tactics to accommodate these challenges. The weapon remained effective throughout 2 wars and served in the Finnish military for more than 5 decades. The story is one of practical engineering, tactical adaptation, and soldiers making effective use of the tools available to them under desperate circumstances. When historians discuss the Winter War and Finland's survival against overwhelming odds, they cite numerous factors: superior tactics, knowledge of terrain, motivation to defend homeland, effective use of limited resources. The L-39 anti-tank rifle appears in these discussions as an example of appropriate technology deployed effectively, and the massive muzzle brake that transformed the weapon from barely controllable to acceptably manageable represents the kind of incremental improvement that, multiplied across dozens of weapons and tactical innovations, allowed Finland to survive when survival seemed impossible. The muzzle brake was not revolutionary, it was evolutionary, a refinement of an existing design, an improvement that made good enough into genuinely effective. But wars are won through accumulation of such improvements. The muzzle brake allowed Finnish L-39 crews to fire more accurately, more rapidly, and for longer periods. That increased effectiveness translated into more Soviet tanks destroyed, more advances halted, more time purchased for Finnish defenses to reorganize and reposition. The strategic impact of one muzzle brake was negligible. The cumulative impact of hundreds of such modifications across the entire Finnish military was the difference between defeat and survival. Today, when firearms enthusiasts and historians examine the L-39 in museums or discuss the weapon in technical forums, the muzzle brake invariably features prominently in the conversation. It is one of the weapon's most visually distinctive features and one of its most functionally significant modifications. The brake transformed how the weapon performed and how soldiers employed it. Without the muzzle brake, the L-39 would have remained an effective but punishing weapon to fire. With the muzzle brake, it became a weapon that Finnish soldiers could employ throughout extended engagements without debilitating physical effects. The story of the massive muzzle brake on the Finnish Lahti L-39 anti-tank rifle is ultimately a story about making the best of difficult circumstances. Finland could not afford to develop entirely new weapons systems. They worked with what they had, improving it incrementally, solving problems as they emerged, and deploying solutions as quickly as they could be manufactured. The muzzle brake exemplified this approach: practical, effective, imperfect, but good enough to make a meaningful difference when combined with skilled soldiers and sound tactics. In warfare, good enough often matters more than perfect. The L-39 muzzle brake was good enough. And for Finnish soldiers fighting to preserve their nation's independence in the winter of 1939, good enough was exactly what they needed.